In this first presentation, we'll review the steps in qualitative data analysis. I will focus on how to prepare textual data for analysis and on coding. Let's first review what is qualitative research. A qualitative research question is a question that asks about social processes or the meaning and cultural significance of people's actions. So when we conduct analysis of qualitative data, we seek to identify concepts, patterns, and relationships that will answer your research question. Dr. Snow and Anderson's study on the homeless is a great example of how qualitative research really highlights social processes and the meaning and cultural significance of people's actions. For example, they found that the homeless experience is very much shaped by interpersonal and institutional factors. Interactions with these factors are a social process that create particular meanings for the individuals. They also found that, contrary to popular opinions, self-esteem was just as important as physiological survival needs among the homeless. Again, this highlights the meaning and cultural significance of people's actions. Why do they say things or do things to maintain self-worth? Let's look at the process of analyzing qualitative data. If you remember, in qualitative research, you may begin analysis while still collecting data. For example, Dr. Snow and Anderson spent 1.5 years collecting data for their book, but during this process they were also engaged in data analysis. In fact, we see that the arrows between collect data, identify concepts, patterns, and relationships, and drawing and evaluating conclusions go both ways. In fact, while you're interviewing, you may realize that a theme is emerging. For example, you're starting to identify a pattern of how parents of adopted kids interact with other parents. So you decide to return to your interview guide and to your data collection and add a new question on this issue. So this is something that you'll remember from previous chapters of how analyzing qualitative data is throughout the process. You don't wait until you've collected all of your data to formally begin. However, once you do have a number of interviews completed, it probably makes sense to start preparing the data for the formal analysis. Let's take a look at that process. So, to prepare qualitative data for analysis, first, you need to transform your data into readable text. This is what I mean when I'm going to say textual data. In order to do that, you record your field notes from your field jottings if you took them. This is usually for ethnography or participant observation. You also transcribe your interviews. So you've already transcribed your interview recording for the exam. Nowadays, there are plenty of free audio-to-text software that you can use to transcribe this very efficiently. You'll also want to check for and resolve errors that occurred in the transcription. This is especially important if you're using an audio-to-text software, since they often make errors. Now, once you have your textual data, you have to think about how to manage it. Well, you will only have one interview. In a full study, you might have 30, 40, or 50 interviews, and interviews that can be quite long. So one way is to organize it by attribute coding. It's very helpful to have the general information about the interview at the top of every transcript document. For example, on a study of sports participation and academic achievement, you'd want to include the participant's pseudonym, age, grade, GPA, gender, ethnicity, since those are the major demographic information that you usually want to know, and any other relevant information, such as whether or not they participate in sports and which ones, and it's also useful to have the date of the interview. You can also include a summary of the main points from the interview so that you don't have to read through the whole thing. Lastly, be sure to store data in a safe, password-protected location in order to protect participants' privacy. Now that your data is prepared, you need to identify concepts, patterns, and relationships. Qualitative researchers use coding to assist with this analysis. So coding means to select parts of your data, so lines from transcribed interviews, and to code them according to certain categories that you find in the data or that you've created from your theoretical framework. So coding summarizes and condenses data and offers you a more conceptual and abstract level of understanding of what the data is saying. So there's a number of ways that you can code. You can action code using gerund verbs to signal activity. Gerund verbs are verbs that end in ing. You can do in vivo coding, which incorporates participants' own words as the codes. And you can also do concept coding. This is where the researcher starts analyzing the text into realms of activity and meaning. For example, the code of identity talk in a homeless study. A good way to start with concept coding is to use your themes from your interview guide. Let's look at some examples. Here's an excerpt of an interview with Barry. He looks after his wife who has Alzheimer's and was just asked, "Have you had to give anything up that you enjoyed doing that was important to you?" Pause the presentation to read Barry's response, and then we'll start coding it. So I hope you've had time to read his response. And for the first coding, let's code for action. So that means that we're looking for phrases that you can explain as an action. So verbs ending in ing. For example, I highlighted this first sentence as giving up activity. Note that I didn't write giving up dancing, which was what he specifically said, because that would have been too specific of a code. Since I only wrote giving up activity, I can use the same code for any other activity that Barry and his wife no longer do. Pause the presentation again and code the rest of this text looking for action codes. So here are some more codes that I came up with. First, I found another giving up activity, bowling. I also found the opposite, activities that they continue to do, continuing activities. And lastly, I coded this as explaining what they do at the activity. So you might have created your own codes, and that's fine. With different researchers, you're usually going to come up with different codes, but hopefully not too different. So let's look at another method of in vivo coding. Remember, with in vivo coding, you use the participant's own words to create a code. For example, Barry starts off by talking about things that he's given up. So I created a code for this. Pause the presentation to code the rest of this excerpt using in vivo coding. So remember that you can use the code we've already created, giving up. Okay, some other codes that I've created using in vivo. So here's another give up code, giving up indoor bowling. Then I coded this text as can't do it, since it highlights his wife's abilities. Lastly, I found this interesting part, having enough. So here he's writing about how they stay at the music club until she's had enough and then they leave. I imagine that while looking after someone with this illness, there are a number of times where they lose patience a bit. So this might be a code that comes up again later. So now that we've taken a look at this excerpt twice already, let's take a look at concept coding. Concept coding starts once you have a good sense of what the participants are telling you. So you are already starting to analyze the data at this point. It helps to keep in mind your own theories that are guiding your research question. So remember, in concept coding, you're looking for realms of meaning and activity. Here's an example of a concept code. So this story that he starts off with, he's telling us this is a story of change. So I've decided to code it as change. Pause the presentation to find other concept codes. Here's some other ones that I found. This one, which could be interesting, is what does he do on his own now? So I've coded it as alone. How they maintain activities, coded as activities. And here are factors such as weather that might influence their activities and whether or not they do something. So an easy way to start with concept codes is to look for the themes that you cover in your interview guide. You can use those as codes and look for them throughout your interview. For your assignment this week, you will code your interview transcript. So you're going to code the transcript to find at least 5 codes. You can use whichever of the coding techniques we've discussed. So you should assign a color for each code and then highlight all text or any text that relates to that code. Remember that you also need to include attribute coding at the top. I include these instructions in the assignment.